1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
Failure of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative.
Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about innovation in the enterprise, brought to you and run by Collective Campus, an innovation hub based in Australia that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies and tools to successfully explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. For more information, go to www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Hi everybody, welcome back to Future Squared. My name is Steve Gluveski and I'll be your host today. I trust you had a wonderful Easter break and you're all set for a big 4-day work week ahead. Just a friendly reminder, we've recently released the innovationmanagershandbook.com, a guide for the innovation manager and corporate entrepreneur. You can download it for free at www.theinnovationmanagershandbook.com. We've got an exciting star-studded array of guests for you on the podcast over the next few weeks, including Whitney Johnson, Braden Kelly, Angela Myers, Ted Rubin, and the one and only Steve Blank. But today I want to introduce Ben Yoskovitz. He's the co-author of Lean Analytics, a book he co-wrote with Alistair Kroll, a guide for organizations who want to use data to grow new businesses faster. Ben has been the VP of product at GoInstant, which was acquired by Salesforce in 2012. He was the founding partner at Year One Labs, an early-stage seed accelerator based in Montreal. One of the companies that came through the program, Localmind, was acquired by Airbnb. He's also made 15-plus angel investments and runs the Instigator Blog, which focuses on lean startup, product management, and entrepreneurship. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ben Yoskovitz. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. You're calling us all the way from Toronto, is that right?
That's correct.
Awesome. I just had a quick look at the Google weather, and I'd say it's quite cold over there.
Well, it's officially spring, but we're not quite there yet. It's kind of raining and a little bit chilly still.
Do you want to remind our audience what the weather is in Fahrenheit, I guess?
Geez, I don't know what it is. You guys...
We use Celsius. I thought I was making it easy for you, but clearly you guys use Celsius.
We use Celsius. No, it's a few degrees above zero, I think, at this point.
Yeah, well, that's not too bad.
Yeah, it's not terrible. It's not terrible.
Yeah, well, it's fall here technically, and we're about 15 degrees, heading for 20, so I'll try not to rub that in too much.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
We will. Anyway, we better get down to business. You're the author of Lean Analytics, which essentially takes the concept of moving quickly, iterating, experimentation, some of the fundamentals underlying lean startup and applies it to analytics. And I suppose the whole lean movement traces its roots back to the lean manufacturing, Toyota's Kaizen approach. And that's obviously birthed also lean UX, what I like to call lean marketing, and of course, Lean Analytics, which you co-authored with Alistair Kroll. Can you tell me a little bit more about what inspired the book?
Sure. So it was about 2010. Mm-hmm. So it's already been quite a few years. I mean, the book's about 3 years old, but it was about 2010, and Alistair and I co-founded with a couple of other guys. At the time, I was in Montreal, a startup accelerator called Year One Labs. Mm-hmm. And this was right around the time that Eric had written Lean Startup. And if we step back a little bit before that, Steve Blank had written his book called 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which many listeners may be familiar with, which was very sort of enterprise software oriented. But having come from that world, so I'm sort of going backwards. I had started a couple of companies in the B2B software space. Mm-hmm. I read 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and honestly, it felt like he had written the book for me, but mostly to remind me of all the mistakes I had made or make me aware of those mistakes. So I was reading 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and I'm like, wow, I did that. Oh, no, I did that. And I was just I couldn't believe how many of these mistakes I had made. And then Eric came out and with the Lean Startup and was like, here is a new way of doing things. And so we started this accelerator called Year One Labs, very small. We were doing 5 companies. Mm-hmm. And we decided to take them through not what I would describe as a curriculum, but a lean startup approach. We said, okay, well, you're going to come in, you're going to validate the problem, you're going to validate your solution, you're going to build an MVP, you're going to get some traction, and really apply these principles of lean startup to these companies, because we brought them in at the idea stage, so incredibly early. And So Eric had this thing called build, measure, learn, this basic lean startup cycle. And, what we found was, people understood the build part fairly well. And a lot of the folks in year one labs were technical. So that wasn't terribly complicated for people. But the measure, learn part was a little bit murky, And so Lean Startup was a great book, and was a great sort of like, here are new ways of thinking about how to build companies or build products. And we just wanted to get more into the weeds. And so where we found people falling off was on that, learn, the measure and learn part of things. And so that's where Lean Analytics came out of, was taking these 5 companies through a lean process, having started companies ourselves and making lots and lots of mistakes. We felt like we wanted to sort of blow up that area, or really focus on the measure learn part of things.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And it's funny you should mention Steve Blank. We've actually got him on the podcast later this week, and I'll be really interested to talk to him about the 4 steps to the epiphany, as well as what I think is one of the best resources for anyone building a startup, the Startup Owner's Manual. But yeah, exactly right. Some of the key mistakes that entrepreneurs make, and something quite common here in Australia, 96% of startups fail to become sustainable businesses, and it's often because they just build stuff that nobody wants. They don't measure anything. They don't define those key assumptions underlying the business model. And I suppose entrepreneurs are wired to kind of chase, the shiny new thing. They're wired to look for product market fit, but sometimes they grow tentacles and they're running in 8 different directions when they can't really hone in on one and really, I suppose, maintain the focus that's required to find product market fit. So perhaps can you tell us a bit about how Lean Analytics helps provide entrepreneurs with a roadmap to avoid what I think you've dubbed the magpie effect?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, startups ultimately fail because they run out of money, and, the founder or founders, close the lights off and go home, and hopefully learn from that and live to fight another day. But if you back up from running out of money, one of the key components of that is losing focus.
Yeah.
Or the other way of looking at that is not quite sure what to focus on. And so Lean Analytics is an attempt by Alistair and myself to help founders or employees, everyone really, figure out what to focus on and when, because the when is also a big part of that, right? So, it's really designed to try to, there's no formula for startup success, of course, by any stretch of the imagination, but to try to provide a framework for how people can think about these things. And what I like to think about is being intellectually honest with yourself, which I think founders often are not. We sort of put this like a bubble around ourselves to sort of gird ourselves against the realities of the world. Yeah. And to some extent, we have to do that. Entrepreneurs have to sort of, to fight the good fight, you need that bit of a reality distortion.
You need that resilience. And, that's right.
Remember, you're also like creating something that doesn't really exist yet, right? And so, you're selling something that doesn't exist. You're convincing people to invest in something that doesn't exist. And so you sort of need that reality distortion field. But when that gets so strong that you're sort of running 100 miles an hour, you crash into a wall and you die. And so Lean Analytics is a framework to sort of poke holes in that reality distortion field, not to eliminate it completely, not to say, hey, you can analyze your way to success, because I actually don't believe that that's true, but to provide sort of a guiding framework. And we looked at 2 vectors primarily. We looked at the business that you're in, which surprisingly is not always obvious to people, and the stage you're at, which is also not always obvious to people. And we sort of looked at those 2 things and said, when you combine these, it comes down to this, what we call the one metric that matters, or a smaller set of numbers by which you can orient yourself and focus on. And again, so all of that comes down to focus. If you can focus and you're focusing ideally on the right thing, or you realize very quickly it's the wrong thing and you move to something else, and your path is a little bit more linear as opposed to just this throwing paint at a wall and watching it splatter, then you have a better chance of navigating your way to success.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you've touched on the one metric that matters, and I guess there's always a risk of paralysis by analysis, not knowing what to measure, perhaps measuring too much. You've mentioned that when you're building something that doesn't exist, or, you're trying to create a new market, there's so many unknowns, the customer demographic, customer segments, how you're going to get your product to market, pricing models, revenue, what features you should build, what the value proposition is, ad copy, imagery, et cetera, and you could have a great idea, a great concept, maybe it's solving a real problem, but if one of these fundamental building blocks is off, it could be the difference between success and failure. So perhaps, do you want to talk a little bit more about the one metric that matters? You mentioned that it's about what business you're in and what stage you're in. Can you please elaborate a little on that?
Sure. I mean, I think, I like to start with the stage you're at. I think it really helps frame things. So, Alistair and I, having worked with a lot of companies, some at Year One Labs, some of our own, some advisory work and other things we've done, we sort of mapped out 5 stages of companies. And we sort of believe, argue, suggest that, all or most companies sort of end up going through these stages. And the first one is empathy. Then you have stickiness, then virality, revenue, and scale. And without going into all of them in detail, each one of them, has effectively a gate, if you want to think about it that way, which you need to get through in order to move from one stage to the next. So if we start at the very earliest stage, which is empathy, it's really just trying to determine whether you have a problem worth solving. Do you actually have, that sort of painkiller versus a vitamin? And so that's the empathy stage. Do you understand your customer? Do you understand the segment you're going after? Do you understand their pain? Will they pay for, what you're offering? And that's that's more B2B centric. Certainly there's consumer angles to that as well. But, that first stage is empathy. And a lot of the metrics there are qualitative in nature, right? Because it's hard to measure something that doesn't exist. But if you can get past that empathy stage, then you go to the stickiness stage. And, stickiness for me is building an MVP, putting it out there, and measuring usage. Now, your goal or target for usage can certainly vary. A consumer application, for example, I would argue has to have a daily use case. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty difficult to get that long-term usage. But some other applications, maybe weekly, maybe monthly, much more than that, and I don't think you can capture people's attention. But that stickiness is, hey, I built this MVP. Does it create value? It might not be the value I thought it was going to create, but does it create value? And the proxy for value is usage, typically, right? And so it's really marching through these stages that helps you sort of understand immediately what area of metrics should I really be caring about that matter. So if we look at stickiness, there may be all kinds of things I'm doing. I may be trying to acquire early adopters. I may be testing different copy and value propositions, as you sort of described. I may be measuring performance of the application. Is it performant? Is it doing what it's supposed to? But at the end of the day, what really matters is usage. Does anybody use this thing? Because if they don't, who cares, right? About all those other things. And so really it hones down to, okay, well, what usage matters and what is the level of usage I would expect that I think is a proxy of value. And so you sort of march through these stages. And what I see with startups is they often think they're at least one stage ahead of where they really are. And so often you'll see, certainly with consumer applications, people go right to the virality stage, which is largely about growth of users, right? Just growth by any means necessary, acquire as many users as we can in the hopes that, by virtue of collecting so many people, we'll be able to generate some value and revenue after. But oftentimes those things are like a house of cards where they sort of fall down after the fact. So when you jump stages, you tend to you're building something on a foundation that's not entirely solid.
It sounds like it aligns somewhat with Dave McClure's Startup Metrics for Pirates in terms of your sort of conversion funnel, acquisition, activation, revenue, referral, and so on. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does. And so Dave's funnel is it's great, and we base some of what some of that framework off of his model. I would say his model is Pirate Metrics is about that. It's about that funnel, right? Of using the product, or at least showing up at the door, getting through the door, activating and getting engaged, staying engaged, and then, having generated enough value for yourself, sharing that with friends, and
That's
then you
right.
create this virtuous cycle. With lean analytics, what we would say is, that cycle probably, exists out of the gate right away. Day one, you launch a landing page, you kind of have that cycle.
Yeah.
What area of that do you really need to focus on out of the gate? Is it drive as many people as you can to the front page? Is it get them through the front door? Or is it activating them to make sure that they stick around? And I would say it's like, obviously you need some people to show up at the front door,
Yeah.
But you don't need that many. What you need is to look at that activation area, which is, do they do, and I'll say what I want them to do, but again, it might be something different that creates other value that's equally or if not more important. But do they do something inside of here, and do they do it at a frequency that demonstrates that this thing is creating value? Because that's likely what's going to cause them to stick around long term, and also likely what's going to cause them to pay, and also what's likely going to cause them to share this with their friends.
Sure. Yeah.
And the truth is, most startups, in my view, fail at the stickiness phase. They pretty decent at validating a problem, although because a lot of that's qualitative, we sort of admit to ourselves, I think, that we're fudging that part of things a little bit. I talked to 10 people, they told me it would be valuable, check mark, done. Okay, I mean, that's maybe not really true, but...
And probably ask yes or no questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of science, if you will, to how you do it and how you extract information. But nevertheless, I always sort of can appreciate that people want to get through that part really quickly. But, when you build something, then it's really hard to lie at that point. You built it, you got, 100 people to show up, nobody uses it, you have a problem.
Yeah.
It becomes much harder to lie. The truth is, a lot of companies just say, good enough, and move to the next stage, which might be, let's acquire more users, let's start spending more money, let's start trying to figure out our unit economics and the revenue model.
That's right.
All of which is ultimately going to break down because you didn't solve a problem worth solving.
Yeah, and I think that's where lean analytics also comes in handy, just fighting some of that human nature to feel productive, to keep moving forward, to build this feature and that feature and make an app available across iOS and Android. And it's easy to jump ahead and just keep busy and feel like you're doing something and kind of jump past, the most important phase, which is really, validating that problem, making sure you've got the business model validated, getting the stickiness right, making sure people not only visiting your site, but activating, signing up to a newsletter, and then, receiving your emails and eventually being sold the actual product and then telling their friends about it. But if you don't spend the time up front to validate all of that and just go straight into development mode, chances are you're probably going to just spend a lot of time and money building stuff that doesn't really work.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, the truth is, and this is human nature, nobody likes to be told they're wrong. And I mean, I recently was toying with some startup ideas in the parenting space. And so, I cobbled some ideas together and sort of some theories and a thesis around some stuff that I thought would be interesting. And I'm like, oh man, I should just go build this thing right now. I'm like, hold on. Like that's insane.
Yeah.
So I put a call out on Twitter and I said, hey, I need to talk to some parents. And I put together my interview questions and I spoke to eight parents, I think, mix of moms and dads, mix of ages of children. And, I got to the end of it and had to be complete. So two things happened. One was didn't really validate, or three things. One was didn't really validate what I wanted to validate.
Right.
So I had to sort of be honest with myself about that. Heard some other things that were interesting that set me off on different paths, and that's sort of the point of going through that exercise. But of course, the third thing was, talking to a friend of mine, I said, I still think my idea is great. I was like, yeah, these parents all told me, didn't quite validate the idea I had, but I still think it's great because that's the hubris of being an entrepreneur, right? So that if you skip those steps completely, you go right to building something, almost guaranteed that you're wrong. And obviously that investment is so much higher. My investment was, 10 hours of time.
Wow. And that's exactly right. And I think, especially for our audience in the corporate world, there is a tendency to wrap every decision that's made around this cloud of sort of certainty. We want to be sure about how big the market is, who the customer is, how much money it's going to cost to develop, how long it's going to take, how much money we're going to make, what the ROI is going to be. But the reality is, when you're building something that is absolutely new, none of that is actually known up front. And while you may, do the dance and put numbers on paper that seem to make sense to finance and support the allocation of capital, it's all based around one big assumption that hasn't been tested, and in most cases, the assumption doesn't really stand up. So, I mean, we recently interviewed David Benetti, who founded the Innovation Options Framework, which basically allocates a value to an idea based on a set of assumptions underlying a business model, and if those assumptions, I suppose, are validated, then you proceed to stage 2, and the value of the option goes up. If they're invalidated, then budget controllers, senior management have a decision to make. They can either keep supporting it or not. I guess it sounds as if the lean analytics approach would actually support innovation options in a way whereby you've got your first stage where it's all about empathy, and just say a particular concept has a value as part of this innovation options framework, and you're trying to validate that by determining whether or not anyone actually wants this product or whether there is a need there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think it's, when we talk about larger companies trying to innovate, I think there's a few sort of ways of thinking about it where I think lean analytics applies. One is even at the feature level, so at the smallest level, if you will, sort of saying, hey, we're going to build features onto an existing product, and I think the way that large companies do that today is probably not as efficient as it could be, and so you can apply lean principles at the feature level. You can also apply them, I think, at the product level. So this is a new product we're developing, but maybe in the same market to the existing customers that we have. So that's not not quite disruptive innovation. It's more just, can we sell more stuff, different stuff, but to the same people. But nevertheless, just because it's the same customer or the same market, you may still get the product wrong. You don't know. So I think you can still apply lean and lean analytics principles to that. And then we get into the totally brand new, the stuff that could potentially go to the extent of cannibalizing the main business. And I think you're right. At that point, certain lean analytics can definitely help. And it is a framework for going through things. And this idea of valuing ideas, assigning some value to them that increases as things go through a pipeline, if you will, or through a funnel, I think helps large companies understand them and rationalize these things without going completely startup, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it just helps product speak finances language in a way, because usually there is a massive misalignment there, particularly if product are all advocates of lean startup and agile, and finance is still kind of treading this traditional sort of approach to capital allocation. Right. And I guess when it comes to testing products at a corporate level, it's funny you should mention that. We've recently done some work with a life insurer who wanted to create a big consumer platform to manage people's health, but they had so many unanswered assumptions. And so, we were basically able to just create, hundreds of landing pages and ads and different ad copy, and then use Google Analytics to see who was actually engaging with this, were they coming back, what features excited them. And I guess I want to use that as a segue into, non-technical companies and how they can use lean analytics to support their own lean startup sort of endeavors.
Sure. So, I mean, most of lean analytics, admittedly, and most of lean startup, I think, certainly at the beginning, was focused on software companies. There's no question about it, right? Sure. And technical companies. But I think these things do apply. The principles of lean analytics, the principles of lean startup apply to non-technical companies. Companies that manufacture goods. And you're starting to see this. I mean, we're already seeing this. Kickstarter as an example for hardware. If we just think about hardware, right? It's still technical, but manufacturing things. Kickstarter as a way of testing something out and pre-validating that you can get orders and drive enough dollars in to drive interest. I mean, that fundamentally, in my mind, changes the way we can manufacture products and put them out there and see if anybody cares. Yeah. And obviously, with any of these things, there are challenges. Like lots of companies go on Kickstarter, they raise the money, they don't deliver because it turns out they're still startups with all kinds of problems. But fundamentally, that idea of, hey, I don't have to, get everything in line to manufacture, 500 million of these widgets that I'm now producing, is interesting. So Kickstarter, I think things like 3D printing, again, a little bit on the technical side. Yeah. But I've talked to companies that do all sorts of things where they've run, and some of it, unfortunately, I can't share, but I've talked to companies that have done all kinds of things where they're testing products in market that are, real MVPs of, food as an example, and they're able to go out, test it, create a scenario where they're able to put, this product into people's hands and see how people react to it. So there are definitely more creative ways of doing things for non-technical companies that can still make sense. I mean, I would also argue, and this is maybe sort of a separate debate, that all companies are tech companies at this point. So I'm not sure if there's an example of a company that isn't a tech company.
That's right.
But I know the intent of your question was, let's get away from software companies for a moment and talk about others. And there's definitely examples of that. It just takes, I think it takes a step back from the way the business has operated for how long it's been in existence, and say, how could we creatively de-risk this thing? Not completely, but how can we creatively do this? A Kickstarter campaign, 3D print some stuff, pre-sell something in another way. What could we do? Test this in real life scenarios. Can we bring our food product to a food fair? Alistair was the co-author of the book. We actually did I'm sort of backtracking, but we actually did a little bit of a case study with a restaurant of a good friend of ours in San Diego, who actually uses data, a couple of key numbers to help him understand the scope of his business. And then we said to him, like, hey, wouldn't a food truck be an MVP for a restaurant?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good example. Like that, I don't know if that's 100% true, and I certainly haven't tried it because I don't own restaurants. But there are ways of testing things. I mean, another example is, why does every person at a restaurant have to get the exact same menu? It's not. They don't have to. You can print different menus. It's not that expensive.
Exactly.
So I think it's just about being creative in how you tackle things. And again, it comes down to the fundamentals of lean and lean analytics, which is, what is the problem you're actually trying to solve? And if you understand that, then you can get creative about how to solve it, which doesn't necessarily involve locking everything into place, building a business plan and a financial model, and then, that's it, you're done.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think there's often a lot of confusion coming from large organizations in terms of what lean startup is, and it's often mistaken as a full-blown product development tool, as opposed to something that helps you, find product market fit, which is where I think the value is. And for non-tech companies, I think you can validate a lot of assumptions underlying a business model without having to build a full-blown sort of prototype. I think of an example here of an insurer called Medibank, and they're a listed organization, highly regulated industry, and therefore they're not able to simply put products to market and test them because you need to go through the regulator, and there's so much sort of red tape around that. But they were able to test appetite for a product which basically allows people to access gyms and fitness centers all over the country simply by heading out to public areas in the central business district, in the vicinity of gyms. I mean, plain clothing, no indication that this was Medibank, and just interviewed people, asked them lots of open-ended questions, told them about the product, asked them what they like, what they don't like, and they were able to, validate a lot of things, a lot of assumptions, but they're also, more importantly, able to invalidate a lot of assumptions, and therefore make changes that were necessary in order to, make that product, I suppose, give that product more chance of success once it finally launched.
Yeah, I'm convinced that even if you interview people, I'll use the word incorrectly, right? Even if you're not an expert at taking this approach, I can almost guarantee that you will learn something through the exercise. And so there's no way that you can go, do as you described, talk to, I'll pick a number, 20, 30 people near gyms, interview them, and be guaranteed that what you build is going to be a successful product. Of course. Right? That's like, there's like a ... in the middle of that, but you could be pretty damn sure that it's going to be better and closer to right as you move forward. And that's not all you're trying to do. I mean, if you could guarantee success, that'd be awesome, but you're just trying to de-risk this thing and make better, smarter decisions over time. Yeah,
that's right. And how do you know, Ben, whether or not, it's time to trust in the data? Say you've been out there, you've been testing, you've got a sample size of 500 customers, and the data suggests that your assumptions are invalid. How do you know if it's time to trust in the data or say, hey, maybe we haven't got enough data, maybe we need to keep testing, we don't want to change something fundamental about the business too early? Seems like a bit of a balancing act. And is there a sense of professional judgment involved there, or?
Yeah, well, what you call professional judgment, I call gut. So yes, absolutely. This is the way I would think about it. And so 500, you're not going to get to any kind of level of statistical significance, right? So when you talk to data scientists, and I love data scientists, but there's no room for them in this process of like, let's go analyze hundreds of thousands of data points. That just doesn't exist early on. Yeah, I would argue even for large companies, because oftentimes, like the example you gave, they're unable to use their brand. They're not interested, nor is it the right time to go and talk to all of their customers, about something that's potentially disruptive. And so it's always going to be a combination of qualitative and quantitative data.
Sure.
And so that's where I think what you describe as professional judgment, I like that term. I'm going to use that. That's where that applies, because that qualitative feedback that you're getting is going to give you hunches and instincts. My example, I spoke to 8 parents, and the trends are already there. I could speak to 20 more, and I'll probably learn more stuff, but the underlying feedback I'm getting is consistent.
Yeah.
And so it's already enough for me. And I would argue the same is true of, I have 500 people, they all started using my product and stopped using my product, or 100 of them are using it, 400 are not. If I combine that with qualitative feedback from the 400 that aren't and the 100 that are, is there enough there to tell me I'm heading in the right direction or I'm really not? And when you feel like you're not heading in the right direction, I think where it becomes more useful or interesting is if in the course of learning that, you discover other things that may be true.
Sure.
So what's hard is when you invalidate something, but you have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
So I've invalidated that this thing, I'm pretty sure this is not true anymore. What's next? I don't know. Usually you're unlikely to shut it down at that point. You're more likely to say, well, let me go collect more data. Really where I think it becomes interesting is when you say, okay, this is not true, but this other thing sounds like it could be true. Let me go explore that. So hopefully it leads you to something new, and it's not just like a wall that you hit.
Yeah, that's right. And one question I always get in my lean startup workshops is, do you test one key assumption, for example, a particular customer segment of, say, 18 to 25-year-old males, or do you apply, say, a machine gun approach and basically see where the appetite is? Have you got any thoughts on that, as opposed to whether you go in with a focused sort of, no, this is who it's for, or just let's put the product out there and then use some analytics software and see what demographics actually respond to it?
I think like a lot of questions or challenges, the answer to that is it depends.
Yeah.
That's the reality, and that's what I think becomes difficult about just in general giving sort of advice on anything. It's without understanding the specific context or the specific goals, it can be quite hard to do. I think both options are somewhat valid. That's the reality of it. The shotgun approach, I think, is riskier and scarier. That's true, right? If you should out of the gate have some sense of who this product is for, right? Sure. If you're like, I think, because otherwise you're kind of moving towards the solution looking for a problem. So I would say more often than not, you have a sense of who the segment is. Yeah. Now, can you test multiple segments at the same time? Sure, I don't see any problem with that. But when you're going really shotgun, like, well, I have no idea who's going to use this, but I'm sure somebody will. That just sounds unrealistic to me.
That's right. Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, we get people who just say, we want to hedge our bets, so we want to test across lots of different segments. But if you're doing that, chances are the ad copy and the offer that you've got doesn't really appeal to any one of those segments, because if you try and be something to everyone, chances are you're nothing to everyone. Yeah.
Well, imagine how the customers feel when you say, you're my bet hedging.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing with you, segment A. Like, thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, forget it. Like, I'm not interested as a consumer or a customer to be the bet hedging piece of it, right? I want you to solve a problem that I have.
That's right.
And I want you to do it now.
Yeah.
And so I think I understand the inclination towards that. I think there are better ways of getting there than just saying, well, I have no idea who's going to use this. Let's just see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an interesting one because sometimes you may be targeting a particular demographic and you may find that 90% of your visitors actually fall under a different demographic. But then the question becomes, well, is it the marketing? Does our marketing need to be improved to tailor for the target market we're actually going after? Or should we be chasing this other market?
Right, and that's, again, why I think mostly about usage.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, of course, if you get a bunch of people, they come in and nobody uses it, then you have to ask the question you just asked, which is it just because the product is wrong? Is it because the marketing is wrong? And these are not easy questions to answer. But if most of the people showing up are a different segment than the one you assume, but they're all using the product to a level that you think demonstrates that it's creating value.
Sure.
I'm okay with that. That there's no reason not to pivot to a different customer segment. But it certainly, the minute you put stuff out there, there's no question that there's more than one variable.
Yeah.
And things get messy and they get and they're muddy, and that's just the reality of building anything, frankly.
Yeah, that's right. And it sounds to me as if, and this is something that I think people in corporate innovation need to really appreciate. There is no silver bullet. Coming from a world where we've traditionally built, incrementally improved products where we knew who the customer was, how much it was going to cost, how long it was going to take to develop, and everything was about certainty. We just need to appreciate that when it comes to corporate innovation and disruptive innovation, there is so much uncertainty. 9 out of 10 things you build will probably flop, but there are tools out there like the Lean Startup, like Lean Analytics, which will help you increase your chances for success rather than just going in essentially blindfolded and hoping for the best.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I think there is no silver bullet. That's 100% true. But there are tools, there are frameworks, there are ways of thinking about problems and solving them that I think make it a more linear path than otherwise. Certainly going in blindfolded, or the old model, which is as you described. Knowing the solution, knowing the problem, knowing the market, knowing the costs. Those days, I think, for many products anyway, are finished. And so if you believe that to be true, then and you don't want to just flail around wildly, which makes no sense.
Yeah.
You need to find some way into the middle and then evolve these things for how your company operates. Lean Analytics is a framework, and I know it helps. I'd like to think it helps, but I know it helps. I know it adds value, but there's no doubt in my mind that as people apply these concepts to what they're doing, they evolve them for their own business, their own industry, their makeup of their company. I mean, there's all these variables that say you can't just have a one-size-fits-all corporate innovation strategy. I just don't think that's true.
No, that's right. That's right. And I guess the world's moving way too quickly to focus on one-size-fits-all sort of innovation strategies, to focus on small incremental improvements. I know Harvard Business School recently published some findings that found that if you successfully explore disruptive innovation as opposed to small incremental innovation, your chances of success in that field are about 6 times greater, and revenue tends to be up to 20 times greater. However, one of the challenges for most large organizations is that when they're allocating resources, they need to say that the market is above a particular size, and disruptive innovation tends to be the markets tend to be quite insignificant or small to begin with. If we look at, for example, simple example, the tablet, when that came along, market size compared to what it is today is insignificant. And therefore, if I am allocating budget to some new product development, why would I invest in something where the market is small? And now, I guess, if markets are small to begin with, how can we use lean analytics to help us frame those decisions, particularly if, like I said, the market's very small and the numbers aren't quite high?
Right. So I think, that's a fair assessment. I think that the tablet's a good example, and there certainly are, products that come out where there almost is no market, and then the market gets created. So that does happen. I think there's ways of doing disruptive innovation where you're not necessarily creating the entire market. I think that's also true. But I guess the way I would look at that, or an example I would give, is something like Airbnb. So, and this I think applies to, obviously lean analytics didn't exist when Airbnb started, but we can, retrofit what they were doing and how they attacked the market to the book. That's pretty convenient, I suppose. but when they started, sort of this concept of couch surfing and borrowing a person's couch, and didn't quite make sense, but that market already existed to some extent. Right? There was already, if you looked for it, and of course, big company, hotel companies obviously didn't look for it, but if you looked for it, you would see this sort of strange, we would describe it at the time as strange behavior taking place, where people were staying in other people's homes and on their couch, and the hosts were cooking breakfast. Now, they couldn't quite validate that, but that market kind of sort of existed. Airbnb comes along, and I wouldn't say that they created the market, because other things existed in the past for house swapping and this sort of thing, but they blew that market up. Right? And they massively increased the size of the market. And when you look at how Airbnb approached things, they took, without calling it lean, a very tactical sort of approach to it. We have this problem. How do we solve this problem? And so the example that we use in the book is around the quality of photos. And so they noticed, looking at their data, which wasn't massive at the time, we're talking back in 2012 now, they looked at their data and they noticed that places that had really, really nice photos got booked more often. I mean, this
surprise.
what a surprise, quelle surprise. But there you have it. So they looked at that and said, hey, wait a second. What's the solution to that, right? So they said, well, why don't we offer free professional photography?
That's right.
And they didn't build a system for doing it, no calendaring, no scheduling, nothing sophisticated. They hired a handful of photographers and, went out to their customers, their hosts, and said, anybody want professional photos? Some people took them up on it. They sent the photographers. They paid for it. Boom, places get booked more.
Done.
Very sort of tactical, practical approach to how do I get more bookings, which is the number one problem.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes perfect sense, because it comes back to empathy, really. I mean, if I'm sitting here in Melbourne and I'm about to book a flight to San Francisco and I'm looking on Airbnb and all I see is really low resolution pictures of someone's half-made bed, chances are I'm not going to be too compelled to drop a few $100s on booking that place.
Right. And so, I think, when you say it, it sounds pretty obvious, of course, more professional photos, but a lot of companies or people might not have looked at it that way. And I think, Airbnb looks at it and says, well, what's our number one thing we need to focus on? We have inventory. We need more people booking on a consistent basis. So they understood what the sort of core problem was that they were trying to solve. And they went and they attacked it by looking at different aspects of the business and saying, oh, we don't need necessarily, obviously they wanted more demand, of course, but they had demand, they had supply. They needed to connect those dots. And one of the ways that they were able to do it was through more professional photography. And so I think all of that to say, again, it's not, at the outset, it's not about the market size. It's about solving a core problem. And in this case, for a very small number of users, but solving it in such an effective way by tackling these things, step by step in a somewhat logical but creative way, to be able to then grow that market exponentially. Now we look at that market and we say, oh yeah, Airbnb is a $20 billion plus company.
Yeah.
Well, that market wasn't worth $20 billion when they started.
Well, that's right. I think there's quite a few letters published on the internet that Brian Chesky received from early stage venture capitalists who basically said, sorry, we're not interested because we don't believe that the market is big enough.
Right. And so I think, and again, look, you may create something, and it's entirely possible that you create a solution for a group of customers or users where the market does end up being too small.
Yeah.
That can also happen. So again, back to, I wish there was a formula, and I wish I had it, because I would own multiple islands and be permanently retired. But that could very well happen. It's a startup. It's risky. That's inherent in the experience. But I would worry less about the market initially and worry more about, can we solve a pain for some early adopters? Can we get the usage where we want it? Can we get those core behavior loops and core experiences where we want them to be, so that we can then scale the market? And one of the things big companies have is distribution. So you may solve a problem, and I'm gesticulating over here, which you can't see, of course, but you may discover this little problem on the left, somewhere far off to the side, and you solve it for a small group of people, and eventually you're able to then leverage the distribution that you have to bring that to a much bigger market.
That's right.
That's the advantage that big companies have. Airbnb had to create that market to some extent, or expand that market on their own. So I think I would worry less about the size of the market and more about the core metrics and the core behaviors that you need to really be understanding and tracking, and then expand into the market over time.
That's right. And I think a couple of things you touched on there, which I found quite interesting, was the fact that analytics may help us to uncover the obvious, which in retrospect seems obvious, such as, the photos that Airbnb were initially using compared to the professional photos that they took later. It seems obvious in retrospect, but at the time, there's so many unknown variables. It's like you don't know what to look at, what's really preventing the business from growing. And second, what you mentioned about corporate distribution, they've got thousands, if not millions of customers. And therefore they're able to go out and test lots of assumptions. They've got that distribution, which is, I guess, why we're seeing a lot of large organizations now teaming up with startups. Because many companies still struggling with some of the inherent culture underlying big business, and therefore not able to move at the pace that a startup moves at, bound by lots of processes and policies internally, which will take a while to change. But they're able to work with startups who can move quickly, can use all these tools, but then give the startups access to this distribution network so they can actually get more meaningful data.
Right. I mean, I think there's a number of ways. There's a number of ways of that working, and I don't think anybody has entirely solved, how corporate innovation should work. And I think it depends a great deal on, the company itself. And I think that companies are going to go through sort of various stages of how they want to try this. They'll probably be a little bit nervous about it at first and take baby steps, and eventually I think it does go towards a model of working really closely with actual startups that live outside of outside of the core, if you will, maybe even co-creating startups in a way that says, hey, we don't even have to own this necessarily, but we want to be involved in the process at the outset and then leverage our distribution later. So I think there's an evolutionary sort of corporate innovation experience that these companies, large companies, are going to go through, and they're already doing.
Yeah. It comes back to, I suppose, the option where they can either partner with startups, they can invest, they can acquire, they can incubate their own projects. There's lots of different approaches, and realistically, I think when it comes to anything in the space of disruptive innovation or startups or just building the unknown, it is all about, in my opinion, taking a portfolio approach. Venture capitalists, it's their business to invest in early stage startups, and they still get it wrong 9 times out of 10. So if you're a large organization who's never really been in this business, you can't expect to say, okay, we're going to find a silver bullet, we're going to invest in this better work.
Right. No, there's no question about it. And I think it just, it starts, I think, with large companies saying, we want to somehow maybe partner with some startups, or we want to invest a little bit, or we want to, try to create some stuff internally. And I think some of that can work. Some of it is, fraught with challenges about being maybe too close to the mothership, if you will. And over time, those models will evolve. And I agree, it is a portfolio approach. I think companies can do a number of different things, and we're certainly seeing that with accelerators, with corporate funds. This is just the way that you're going to have to try to do some stuff, see what works, see what doesn't work. It's going to take multiple years to figure these processes out. But at the end of the day, when you look at the data, and the data says that large companies are falling apart at a faster rate than ever before, which is it's hard to argue with that data. That's right. Sometimes the data, in fact, doesn't lie, so that's great. if you believe that, if you look at the data and say, well, I can't argue with it, then you've got to do something about it.
That's right. I think we might close up with one question from a listener, Ben. And I think I know the answer based on today's conversation, but for their benefit, they're keen on finding out what success looks like. For example, we have a baseline where we are today versus our ideal metric where we want to be tomorrow. And they're keen on finding out what kind of variables should we consider when determining where we want to be tomorrow. And I guess before you jump in, I mean, some things that come to mind in terms of the way we've sort of approached this in the past is, what do we think the number of available customers are, your cost per acquisition, lifetime value, and then, what's your target profit, and then trying to work backwards. I think that's one approach that may make sense, but perhaps you've got some other thoughts on this.
No, I mean, I think that does make sense when you look at the business sort of holistically and you try to map that business out and say, what are sort of the targets that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
If I go the other way, which is more bottom up, which says, I have to go, because that's sort of like assuming I know what profit I need. And I think sometimes that's, putting the cart a little bit before the horse. Right. I would say, so when we think about, in the book, we call these things lines in the sand, which are sort of targets that we want to hit for specific metrics. And then the other thing is, I think of metrics like, we describe them as squeeze toys. So when you focus on one area of the business, let's say, getting people to use my product at all, or at a frequency that makes sense, then when you focus on that, and you get that to a level that you're comfortable with, that and if we unpack that, that's where some of the trouble is, right? Well, what level do I need? But that usually will tell me what's the next thing I need to focus on. Sure. And so, in that case, it would be, well, they're using it enough. Now do they convert and pay me money, for example, if I'm thinking about a SaaS business? So I would think about it step by step based on the stage that you're at. Now, the benchmark for certain numbers, like what should my conversion be on my website to a free sign up? What should my trial to paid conversion look like? Those numbers are actually, as far as benchmark go, very hard to acquire.
Sure.
They're industry dependent. They change quite regularly. Yeah. So you kind of have to do your homework. You have to do research. You have to look at what the market tells you. You have to use your gut, if you will, to figure it out. But sort of, if you look at the stages you're at and you look at the business you're in, it should usually tell you at least what number you need to focus on as the one metric that matters. And then what success looks like for that specific number is have a target, aim for that target, iterate your way towards that target, and that usually will tell you what the next number is. And we mentioned build, measure, learn at the very beginning of this. And so in Lean Analytics, we have what's called the Lean Analytics cycle. And that's essentially build, measure, learn, just sort of in a lot more detail. And so that's kind of the way I would look at it. Ultimately, what success looks like for a business, is going to be, I think, again, it's partially dependent on the goals. It may be, I've invested in a startup to see if this technology will work. It does work, and then I'm going to acqui-hire them and acquire the technology to scale it through my distribution channels. That might be one thing, or it might be, I'm co-creating a business over here. It's going to be completely independent, and it's going to be measured on its own success, which ultimately will be things like revenue and profit. But at the granular level, I would look at it metric by metric, one at a time, and then use sort of that build, measure, learn cycle to test my way towards success.
No, that makes perfect sense, Ben. Thank you so much for that. That's been great. I'm sure our audience would like to find out a little bit more about you and some of your work. Where can they go to find out?
Well, I have a blog that I've been writing for many, many years at instigatorblog.com. And then Lean Analytics, certainly if you Google that, it's leananalyticsbook.com. I'm at Byosko, so Byosko on Twitter. Those are the best places to find me. Great,
thank you so much. Okay, well, I'll pass those details on to our listeners through the show notes as well on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And thank you so much, Ben, for being with us. You've been an awesome guest. Those insights were fantastic. And I'll leave you to rugging up over in Toronto.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben. Cheers.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. Steve here. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast with Ben Yoskovitz. I know I did. If you have any questions about the program or any questions for our upcoming guests, please do so by reaching out at steve@collectivecamp.us. Until next time, Future Squared out.